Levi, welcome back.
Carey, it's good to be back anywhere. It means I didn't flub it too bad last time, right?
What's that?
It means I must not have flubbed it too bad last time to get welcome back.
You did great. I love having you on because you tell it like it is. And I think, well, there's your personality, but there's also your geography. It makes it such a fascinating story, like your church and what you're doing. And you don't get all the advantages of a big city or the disadvantage of a big city. But I just love our conversations and I love you. And I learned one of the reasons why is we're both tea drinkers, which is rare.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you, Generis Lusko, for converting me. And, in the pandemic, Carey, I learned I have to limit my caffeine consumption. There were a number of things that were a part of the process, but I don't know if I've told you this, I began having for the first time pretty severe panic attacks in 2020. Everybody was having mental health crisis. I get it. But for me, one aspect of it, there was a lot to it. One thing was not traveling, not getting that adrenaline boost that normally came from another flight, another thing, another stage. But there was also a big caffeine dependence. And I had to pull out afternoon caffeine, but also pre-workout. I had switched pre-workouts, which was, I found out, you take a lot of guys in the gym, take this stuff that kind of gets you pumped up to work out. Mine had like 9 servings of caffeine or something on it. And I found out the kind I was using also had some other things. And one of the side effects on the website was in some people may cause anxiety. And it was literally like clockwork 4 or 5 hours after taking this stuff that was kicking in. And so it was just for me, one of those things like, I'm making this harder on myself than I need to. So normally after 1 o'clock, I switched to decaf tea instead of coffee.
That's insane, man. 9 cups of coffee, like 9 doses of caffeine in a pre-workout
something like that, plus testosterone and whatever else.
Years ago, I used to do Red Bull, and my wife, who's also a pharmacist, she's like, that stuff will kill your heart. So, but it would get me racing.
Yeah, my therapist said, even if you didn't have anxiety, this would give it to you. So what are you doing?
Let's talk about that. That was one of my questions. And I knew that there was stress. I don't think I remembered that there were panic attacks. So it got pretty deep. I think I might have had one once. Like, if you're not sure, you probably never had one. People with panic attacks are like, yeah, you don't know what you're talking about. If you think you had one.
Yeah, it's like, have you ever been hit by a bus? Yes,
yeah,
you would know. Yeah.
What happened with that, Levi?
Oh, geez. Well, for me, anxiety started as a child. I would have what's called night terrors.
Oh, yeah.
Which is basically 3 a.m, soaking wet with sweat and terrified. My mom would find me in different parts of the house, just not there. Like my eyes, like it's like a nightmare that you're physically awake for, but not mentally awake from. So you're still walking around the house, but in the dream still. And those were regular and routine for me, which I found, long story, in 2020, in all the different therapy I was doing, I found out there were some things that it's a form of PTSD, some things I had been through as a child that causes that to become a part of what you're dealing with.
That's the theory?
Well, it's a theory of an explanation for it, basically. We had been through some things as a family, and then even with my parents' divorce and just some things that were roots of that. So that low-lying anxiety kind of there, it continued to raise its head. Anytime, like when I first started preaching, I would stay awake almost all night the night before, terrified, thinking about the sermon, but in a bad way, like ruminating over my fear that my message wasn't good, the terror of getting on stage. Goodness. Then it would culminate in me vomiting backstage almost every time I spoke for the first couple of years.
Wow.
And then I worked through that, just really paralyzing fear. And then, when the pandemic, and it actually had gotten better. I had gotten better at working through it, but then in March 2020, everything changes. You're biologically living. I flew 175 flights in 2019, and then 2020, March 11th, everything comes screeching to a halt, and your body's like, where's the next hit of that kind of adrenaline? And now, it's like they say soldiers don't get PTSD at war; they get it at home. it was almost like my body now is going to start feeling all of that. And in May, my wife breaks her ankle. The same day she preaches her first series of sermons on her book, The Fight to Flourish. And that day for me was the beginning. I had said to her, I don't have to preach for the next month because she was going to do a series based on her book. That night, lying in bed, I began to sweat everywhere from my hands, like profusely, like I was about to run a marathon. And I looked at my wife and I was like, this is weird. And then I feel my heart and it's like, I could see it beating. And all of a sudden the whole world starts spinning. And it's just like, I thought I was having a heart attack at first. And I was like, I need you to pray for me right now. And it just gets worse and not better. I grab my Bible, I'm training my Bible, all the words are spinning. And I'm like, I need to take a shower. So I go in the shower and I'm like trying to calm down, but getting more keyed up. And my next door neighbor is a police officer. And I kept thinking, I need to go knock on the door and ask him to put me in handcuffs. Like that was what my most coherent thought I could think, because I thought, I don't know what I'm going to do. If I let myself chill down for a second, I thought I was going to start pacing or go drive my car off a cliff or just something terrible. And your mind's just going 1,000 miles an hour. And it was terrifying. I wouldn't wish it on anybody because I felt so completely out of control.
Oh my goodness, Levi. Wow. What happened after that?
Well, eventually my wife got this app and starts playing this app that's basically like a bunch of scripture meditations that it reads over you. And eventually I fell asleep a couple hours later. And the next night was the worst because I'm walking up the stairs at bedtime and I'm thinking, is this going to happen again? Like, was that a fluke thing? What was that? I don't know what's going on. And so then you're like, kind of like, it's like waiting for it to sneak up on you. And it indeed, that kind of precipitated it again, so it happened for several nights in a row. I mean, meanwhile, I'm calling my counselor, I'm going into my doctor and I'm like, what is it? Like, they're doing tests. Like, is this some anomaly? Is it something in my brain, in my body? What is going on? And long story short, I approached it from every angle. I approached it from the angle of medically, and I got a prescription for Xanax so that I could put those fires out if need be. I approached it from the perspective of spiritually, what of this component is spiritual warfare. I looked at it, of course, factoring in the fact that the world's gone crazy, and I'm feeling the pressure.
There is that. Mm-hmm.
And then I also got into a lot of counseling to deal with, what is it from my past I hadn't dealt with? What is it, factors that were unhealthy in my schedule in life? But then the biggest thing, Carey, and this was the trippiest part, my psychologist said, like, this is actually biological. And the biggest breakthrough came from learning to breathe through it. So I would do just very simple breathing exercises, focusing on coherence, which is the pattern between your heart rate and your breathing. And through a series of body scans and breathing exercises, I was able to actually target the biological, autonomic nervous system and bring that down from the heightened state of arousal. And now I've learned to build my life based on rhythms, sprint seasons, recovery, Sabbath days off. I have another cell phone that can't get text messages and that can't get emails and Instagram. And that, I'll take with me on a ski day or take with me on a fishing day. And no one can call me except for my wife and my assistant and my dad, and it's not like I can sit there obsessing over whatever,
Thank you for sharing all of that. It's interesting because that was one of my questions for you. Like, what did you learn about yourself during the pandemic? That's like getting a master's degree in self, I think, during the pandemic. How under control is it now? Like, very good.
I had a scare 2 weeks ago, but I found out I was sick. I started getting sweaty and I was like, oh no, it's happening. And so I'm like, I haven't had a panic attack in well over a year. And so I was like, this is not good. But then I went in and got a test and I had influenza A. And so I'm like, okay, it's just a fever. Yeah. But it definitely was a scare because I thought it was coming on the all too, feeling of feeling really hot kind of as a precursor for it,
Well, it's interesting. You said something, it might be the opening chapter or the introduction of the book, but you say you count syllables in sentences, which I thought was really interesting.
I'm neurotic, Carey, for
Tell me
sure.
about that.
If I'm lying in bed and I say a sentence, I will count how many syllables there are in that sentence. And if that was 10 syllables. But if it's odd, as a child, I would need to instinctively reframe the sentence so that the amount of syllables could be even instead of odd. And it was just a thing I would do. And I would usually I would catch myself saying the sentence I had just said again to make sure that it had an even amount of syllables instead of an odd one. And so that's been something like just a weird tick about me, a little obsessive, compulsive when it comes to words and the verbal rhythmic characteristic of sentences, which is a weird thing, but also the way I describe it in the book is that's the dark side of my moon, And so if I let that go to its weirdest extent, it could become dangerous. But if I allow God to use it in a positive way, that makes me great at forming sticky sentences in books and in sermons.
Mm-hmm. So does that still happen in a conversation like this? So I don't see how it could. Or is
I've
it
more learned to block it out, and it's something that I'm aware of. That I just am not watching that screen. It's like when you're in Applebee's and you see the TV game, but you want to focus on your daughter.
Yeah,
you can know that it's there, but not be paying attention to it. So I've just learned to block out that kind of stimuli.
It's funny how we learned a lot about ourselves over the last couple of years because like you, I don't know, it was 175 flights, but it was 150,000 miles in 2019. And I think it was at like 42,000 when the world closed. So it was going to be a record year.
Yeah.
And there was the first month of not panic attacks for me, but just panic. Like, what are you going to do? And then things settled down. And, I wrote a book like you did, and it came out end of 2021. So I was literally writing the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 8th draft during the pandemic. And I kept learning that I had lower gears because here I had this system that kept me out of burnout for over 15 years that I was sharing with leaders because it's worked in other leaders' life too. And I'm like, oh, I have a lower gear than I thought I did when I wrote the first draft of this. And it kept going. And I think it took about a year for me to go, oh, this is what calm looks like. Like, this is my baseline. This is where I want to gauge my life. And then if I ramp up for a season, I can ramp up. But this should be the resting state I can come back to multiple times in the course of a year. And so that was a real surprise for me. What else did you learn about yourself over the last couple of years?
Yeah.
Not that wasn't big enough.
A lower baseline was important. The way my psychologist frames it is your state of arousal based on whatever. Writing a sermon is a state of arousal. A tough meeting is a state of arousal. Anything that's intense that requires you to be fully yourself. So coming into this, I have to be somewhat aroused in the sense that I'm having to respond. I know I'm asking questions. I'm speaking to a lot of leaders. So that's a peak. And then if I'm trying to come down and I have another peak quickly, then I can't come all the way down to my baseline. I'm going to the next one. And so eventually, and how it should be is aroused and then low and then big and then low. And then my Sabbath day, you know what I mean? My night without my phone. But if I'm on all the time, if I'm on news all the time, like I was talking to my mom a minute ago, she's like, I want to say goodbye in case the nuclear bombs start falling, Levi, and we can't get on the internet. And I said, Mom, can you tell me how many hours you spent on news yesterday? And she said, just 7. Just 7. I said, Mom, you're not designed for that. Your soul can't handle that. You should know enough to be praying for of course the situation in the Ukraine and let that be informed. It's irresponsible though for you to take in as much stimulation as God takes in, which is what you're trying to do. So again, if you don't come down, then you're starting your next peak from a middle instead of a lower gear, like you said. So, and then eventually you get to a point where you're just like this, and then everything starts to float over. Then everything starts to feel like this is out of control. I'm out of control. You cannot sustain that forever. The body does, of course, as they say, keep score. So I think I learned for myself, I was humbled in learning that I cannot sustain, and I'm grateful. My failure and burnout manifested as panic attacks and not as an affair or as, self-destruction in a different way. I'm grateful God broke through and I was able to make some pivots and now be at a healthier place.
And I know neither of us are psychologists, but on a semi-serious question, do you think if this had been uninterrupted, it could have manifested itself in another direction? Because I think about my burnout all those years ago, and it was the first time in my life I went like, oh, when you're feeling like this is why you have an affair. This is why you quit your job. This is why you end up with an addiction. And fortunately for me, none of those things happened. It kind of all imploded rather than exploded.
Yeah.
But, it gave me a lot of understanding in that moment. Like, do you think sometimes it's those things, like that kind of adrenaline addiction, if you want to call it that causes people to go in rogue directions?
Absolutely. I think God is gracious enough to me to have got my attention and I could listen. I 1,000%. I think sex is very seldom about sex. I think a lot of the things, even in online gambling or a drug addiction, I think those are very, very, very often not about the actual thing. They're about something else. And yeah, so I think that brokenness, being aware of it, and then also, I'm turning 40 this year, and I think it's no mistake. It's all of course almost a trope that middle age, but it's like this crisis can be a good thing if you learn the right thing and make some changes and then figure out your seasons. What do seasons look like? I read Ronald Rolheiser's book, Sacred Fire, and just figuring out, okay, you have your young season, middle season, knowing the season of legacy and the season of, then learning to give it all away. And all the crisis, so to speak, and bad decisions often comes from a failure to diagnose the season you're in and what you should be doing about it.
Yeah, I think it was Gordon MacDonald on this show, and I might get the years slightly wrong, but 38 to 42 is that window for a lot of leaders where they go through some kind of crisis. And, hopefully that was yours, right? And mine was burnout.
Let's hope
I was 41.
Let's hope that was the crisis. I got it out of the way.
Like, Lord, is this as bad as it gets? Like, that's okay, right? No, thank you. And that is super helpful. So moving forward, when you think, and I love that term of baseline, I talked about it a little bit at the end of At Your Best, and I wish I had talked about it more, but that is something I used to find a couple times a year or once a year, and now I want to find it on a weekly basis. Huge. Like I want to go to that place of, maybe this isn't the right word, but stasis, just you're kind of in this place where you're at peace, you're at rest, and then the work comes out of that rather than adrenaline, dopamine, which driven people can do.
And you end up turning to Red Bulls, like you said, or turning to other stimulants quite frankly, there's a lot of workaholics who that's why all the trope is of the Wall Street guys getting coked up. You know what I mean? They don't have that lower place to come from. And if you don't have it, you're going to have to manufacture your ability to get up to try to get to a higher level than you actually can even get to, I think.
So what do your rhythms look like now?
Yeah, so a couple things, I would say I'm taking less on. I'm making my yeses the right ones, hopefully. I still get that wrong, of course. But I'm also, I used to always really try and be efficient. Efficiency, I say in the book, I've said to you, is kind of a heroin to me. So the idea of, I pre-recorded this, I did that, I was out there, and I was like, no, I'm not doing that. I'm going to schedule myself out and be off, and actually be off. And my psychologist, is one of the things he really wanted me to do is schedule the day after a thing to be a recovery day. So yesterday, I woke up in Houston. I preached the night before to a pastor's conference, and I normally might have taken the 6 a.m. flight to get home by lunch and then had the work day. And instead, I picked a 4 o'clock flight and had the day with nothing. I didn't set an alarm. I woke up when my body woke me up, which as it turned out was 7 a.m. I went and had my quiet time, got in the hot tub, took a hot tub at the hotel, had breakfast with friends, and literally just that baseline of a come down. The night before, new message, 3,000 liters, right? So it's like the next day, come down day. And I gave myself permission. I brought a couple staff members. We played Yahtzee in the airport. I bring Yahtzee with me on the planes. We'll play cards, deck of cards. My family and I, we have this little ball It's a bouncy ball. I bring it with me at all times. And when we're walking around, we bounce the ball to each other. We'll sit around at the end of the day and bounce the ball back and forth. It's little things like that. That's a $5 ball. Yahtzee costs $19 at Walmart. But the rolling dice and figuring that, those are things to me that are it's the new me. And my family appreciates it. They call me relaxed dad because I used to be more keyed up. And now it's like they joke that I'm relaxed dad. And I'm not always that, but I'm trying for it. And so those are some of the things. Other things, taking up fly fishing, taking up renewed interest in tennis. And then I've recently begun split boarding, which is you ski up the mountain instead of going up the chairlift. And then you transition at the top and you ski down. That's been a new thing that I've taken up.
Good for you. Yeah, so if you don't mind, and if it's too personal, we can move on to other things. But you're reminding me we've got a parallel story there, so I'm kind of locked in on it. You talk about being a different kind of dad. My kids are older than yours. I'm older than yours by a bit, older than you. And my kids are 30 and 26 now. And we've talked about getting my 30s back. Like if I could get my 30s back, and I knew then, and I was as I am now back then, I think I would have been a better father. If those irritants showed up at home, how would they have shown up with, ramped up Levi? What would be a dynamic at home, and how are you hoping to make that different moving forward?
Carey, we planted the church at 24, and I had that 6 years of the initial base jumping, which is what church planting is like.
Yeah.
It's you're jumping out of the airplane. It's the ultimate adrenaline spike, Mm-hmm. We didn't have an ARC organization around us or any kind of church planting network. All my friends who were older who had planted churches, they had done it back in the 70s and 80s. And so when I would ask them, like, what'd you do? They're like, we did a tape ministry. I'm like, I don't know if that's going to work, but we were just figuring it out. But the first 6 years were our explosive growth and, just intensity. Mm-hmm. And in the meantime, that was when we had our first 3 or 4 kids. And then Jenny and I were 30 when Linya went home to be with Jesus. Mm-hmm. And healthy or not, a big part of our grief was, well, for me, I'll say this, was putting my pedal to the absolute floor. Like it was a kind of a way of, the devil did this and we're going to make him pay. And which is great. This is wonderful. But it also, I would say the intensity of pace of ministry, yes to everything. Yes to anything that would bring honor to God and, make Linya happy in heaven. And that was kind of my way of coping through this. And part of what created the credit card bill for me to pay when I turned 40. Preaching, going. Right. I went to South Africa twice for a weekend, right? Twice for a weekend. Okay. Let that sink in.
That wins some kind of award.
Right. Yeah. Or of stupidity, So new Levi would have tagged 2 days on and actually seen South Africa. We went through a drive-through lion petting on the way to the airport. It was like, what did you see in South Africa? I think I petted a lion out of a window of a car, and then I was on the flight again. And I think that, again, it was, well, I'm going to get back. I'm going to preach the next Sunday. You know what I mean? Why? Mm-hmm. Well, because life is short, and then, only what you do in this life rings on into eternity. Great concept, not well lived out. You know what I mean? To get to your 60s with that. And I think I was headed towards probably an early grave at that pace. And I think the hopefully relaxed Levi understands both urgency and recovery are equally important parts of that coin. And Jesus knew that the night is coming when no man can work, John 9, but he also knew, hey, let's get away to a quiet place and rest.
What did you say? I want to write that down. You said, I'm just writing it down and I lost
Both urgency and recovery are equally important. And it's not one or the other. Because if you go all recovery, no urgency, that's not good. There is hell. There is a short time to do our things. So you can't have a lackadaisical sense of like, whatever happens, happens, and God does what he does. No, it's like God wants the laborers are few, get into the field and pull some grain. But then Sabbath is coming, so set your sickle down, So it's like they feel like it's like God's sovereignty and man's will. They seem like they would cancel each other out, but they don't. It's like what holds up a suspension bridge is tension.
So one of the things that gets me in this, because it's very easy for me to look back on those first 40 years and go, that was a mistake that God didn't use. And yet he did use it. People came to faith. The church grew. People came to know Jesus. There are things I would do differently, that would probably create less collateral damage in relationships, etc. And yet God used it. So I'm curious, when you look at that through a theological lens, was it that God suddenly showed up now that you've dealt with your issues, or he was present through all of it? Like I'm thinking about younger leaders who are like, so at 38 to 41, do we just hit the wall and then we become like Levi and Carey did? Or like, what would you say to younger leaders listening who are trying to figure out where God is in the mix of their dysfunction / passion?
What a wonderful question. The interview I did with John Mark Comer once made me laugh because he said, my first 20 years at Bridgetown, it was all nothing. Like I was wrong. My motives were wrong. I wanted to build a megachurch. It was all about me. None of that counted. And I stopped him right there and said, bro, that is such a unintegrated way of looking back at yourself. Because back then there were certainly motives that were pure, just like there were motives that were askew. There were certainly days that you'd led badly, but there were also sermons you preached because God spoke to you. And my counselor is always saying to me, and he received what I was saying. I was saying, you can't just write off all of that period as all bad. Yeah. My counselor showed me that I do, how the people said, give us Barabbas. And a week before they were like putting palm branches down going, Hosanna, Hosanna. He showed me that I do the same thing to me, right? So the people were lauding Jesus as a Messiah. And then when he disappointed their expectations, they wanted a murderer to be released to them and Jesus be killed. He showed me, I do the same thing to me. So if I'm killing it and having a great day, I tend to go, Levi is the best. He preached it so well, right? Now it's very rare I say that, but then I have a bad leadership day. I don't feel like I was a great boss to my staff. I don't feel like I was a great husband to Jenny or dad to my kids, or I'm just the worst. And then I tend to go, I'm all bad. And I'm either all positive or all bad. But here's the truth. If I look at myself as an integrated whole, I know I have strengths and weaknesses. I've got shadow and bright spots. And I go, I bring all of who I am to everything. And there's going to be days where I let people down, but I can't live or die by their expectations or my own. And so I think as I look back on my 20s and 30s, I smile and I'm not like, what an idiot. I go, you know what? There's a young guy who had a real call from God, did some things wrong, wouldn't do all that again. And I look back at even my sermon notes. I mean, my sermon notes used to be 5,000 word manuscripts. And now I'm it's just different. I smile at my young self and I go, you were developing, you were figuring it out. You made some mistakes along the way, but it took you to get to me. It took that to get to here. So to the person in your 20s and 30s, I would say learn from our hindsight for sure, but you're going to make some mistakes, and that's part of the developmental process of every human being.
It's a great answer. And you know what? I'm learning to look back on my younger self and smile, because I did the same thing. It was like hero or zero, right? It was binary. And it's not binary, and God was very present in my life. And I mean, if you don't believe that, please read the Old Testament. Like you need 20 minutes in the Old Testament to go, these people are...
And the New Testament and church history.
These people are disasters, and God uses them, right? And
that's part of the problem of canceling everyone from history, right? It's the assumption that someone has to be all good or it must be all deleted. It's a sense of like with humility to go, these are broken people. Was George Washington a contradiction? Yes. Was there some really incredible things we can learn from? Absolutely.
Well, and the other thing too, and I think that's true culturally. I mean, we could go off on that to say, so everybody else in history was wrong and we have it right and we've got it figured out. And this is the definition of what right is. That's a mistake, but we can do that to ourselves too, right? Like I can say, well, now I'm evolved, I'm brilliant and my motives are pure. And the reality is, no, my motives are still mixed. Maybe they're less mixed than they were 20 years ago, but I have good days and bad days, and I'm going to make mistakes. And I'm going to look at 57-year-old Carey 10 years from now and go, what were you thinking? And then 67-year-old Carey or 77-year-old Carey will look at 67-year-old Carey and go, you still hadn't figured that out yet? I don't know.
Yeah.
Like
Jerry Seinfeld was interviewed and he was asked, about something like that. What do you think of your old material? And he said, everyone's impulse when they hear their old self, you're telling a joke is to go, you're so stupid. I can't believe it. But he said, he said, really, it took that young version of yourself figuring that stuff out to get to where you are today. So he said, be kind to your younger self. And what a thought. And that's not being dismissive of faults, but it's also just being patient with who it took for you to get to where you are.
Man, I love this conversation. Any other learnings, gleanings from the last 2 years about self-awareness, personal knowledge, spiritual growth? Any of that?
Yeah, I mean, what we've been saying, that's just, it's been a great journey, And I think I still maintain it is an honor to be entrusted with these complicated times. Yeah. I see pastors and leaders burning out and dropping out. And I just would say, don't throw your hands up because it's hard. Like dig in and see that it's so important you do because of how hard it is. And this is, it's an honor to be trusted with our time at the watch, because it's going to come and go like that. So, be able to every day work hard, lay your head on the pillow, having given it your all, and then rest and let the one who actually holds the world on his shoulders hold it while you're sleeping and while you're out fly fishing or whatever it is that's going to, float your boat.
Have you read the book 4,000 Weeks by Oliver Burkeman? Do you know of that?
No, but I will.
I will
Sounds
send
great.
you a copy. Don't buy it. I'm going to send you a copy.
Okay.
I'm interviewing him actually tomorrow as we're recording this. I don't know whether it'll air before or after this episode. Really interesting book on time management that's sort of taking the world by storm right now. And it's very philosophical, almost theological. I have a list of questions I want to ask him, but it feels like you are discovering some of the lessons like I had that he talks about in the book. And one of the things he says is, and I want to push him on this because I don't think he's writing from a faith perspective, but the coming apocalypse. And he makes the argument that, well, maybe the apocalypse is here. I mean, the ice caps are melting and nuclear war is a possibility. And, he wrote it before nuclear war. But, to your mother's point, you can watch this stuff and just be absolutely despairing. He has a lot of other great things to say. But on that note, leading into a potential, I think about leaders who led through the Second World War. Like the church was active in the First and Second World War. We're now where paradise has been lost, secular paradise has been lost, and we're leading into an uncertain future. When you think about the mission of your church and the mission of the church, how does that change your passion for ministry, approach to ministry? And because you're right, so many people have checked out, you're leaning in. How do you lead in such an uncertain context, I guess is my question.
Yeah, well, I know imperfectly for sure. And on that note of the 4,000 weeks apocalypse, one of the things I told my mom to do was read The Vile and the Splendid, on Winston Churchill and specifically the Battle of Britain in World War II, and just get a reality check. They had bombs dropping on them every day for 57 days or something like that. And Churchill's like giving it us all week, but then what he did on the weekends? He went to Chequers, his little weekend estate, and he played tennis, and he brunched and he drank champagne, and it was almost this sense of like, that seems almost manic, but it's not. It's him realizing keep calm and carry on really is the only act of defiance. If we all freak out, what is that going to do? Jesus said wars, rumors of wars, pestilence, famine, like, okay, yeah. All right, check. All right, great. So we're on track. Jesus is still in control. None of this caught him off guard from 33. He called this. So here we sit. So what's going to be the coming days? Probably famine, probably disease, probably pestilences, sick. So preach the gospel to every creature. And then have a great meal and eat a quesadilla and, go bowling. And what are you going to do by worrying? Can you change one color of your hair? And you might be worried about a nuclear bomb, but you might actually have a heart attack next Thursday. So how do you want your last 5 days to go? Be found faithful, plant a freaking tree, and quit crying about it. And so my thing is yeah, let's lean in. This is not a time to abandon. This is not a time to get wobbly knees, like Thatcher said to Reagan, in the Cold War, the original, one iteration of it. It's not the first time that a James Bond supervillain has been in control of, an arsenal of
nuclear
weapons.
Arsenal. We lived through
the Cuban Missile, JFK. I mean, that's what I've spent the last 2 years in the 60s. That's where I've been living with the space race. So to me, I'm like, I don't know, this is a thing, but at the same time, I've got friends who are astronauts who have such warm relationships with Russian cosmonauts, who see that the Russian people are suffering too for this. And so I'm leaned in, and our big thing, Carey, and I've told you this, is we're doubling and tripling down on youth. You know,
you
I've got
a passion. You just came back. Was that If Gathering you were at, or was it another?
No, I did. I don't know. I've always done something, but yes, passion. We're doing our own youth conference in Montana. We rented a rodeo arena. We're basically planning a cross between the Passion Conference and Yellowstone's, like John Dutton, and in an emotion conference
together.
Yeah, so rodeo arena, outdoor in the mountains in August in Montana. Youth groups from around the country invited into our state. We're putting on a great morning and evening programming with the Tebows and Carrie Job and Crowder and Cody Carnes. And then in the daytime, the youth groups can whitewater raft or horseback ride or do anything they want. But we are making 60 acres available for tent camping. I got saved sleeping under the stars at a camp. And I think there's something missing, especially in VR goggle world and TikTok, this and hotel rooms. I just think there's something about nature, something about getting outside. What do they do with kids on drugs? They send them to Alaska to live in the wild. So I feel like I really want to see young people experience God and come to know Jesus and kind of live that Montana life for a week.
Do you see a hunger there in the next generation when you interact with them?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, passion, you see, it was 60,000 college students, surrendering on their knees, worshiping Jesus. Actually, matter of fact, funny story, I've never told this. I was on a flight recently and someone who worked for Kanye West was there, and they had randomly been at Passion, and they were not a Jesus person, but there was one moment where Jenny Allen gave everybody a chance to confess their sins if they wanted to each other, like James says. Everyone was told literally confess a sin to the person to your right, to your left. And I was sitting with some friends. I invited the Passion. I confessed a sin, reciprocated, and we were all doing that, like the Bible says. And it was unbelievable because there's this big window at the Mercedes-Benz Arena. And at that moment, the light started shining in, the sun lined up with the window, and a beam of light started filling the arena up. And this woman, she says she's some high up in the organization working for Kanye. She said she's never experienced anything quite like that, and it really shook her to experience that. And she said it opened a door for a conversation. So we're going back and forth a little bit just about Jesus and just what that impact felt like to her to see young people taking their faith seriously. To me, I just see that's the play, that's the move. It's the next generation.
I love how you're advancing into that, not just hoping they're all going to show up at your doorstep. Okay.
Yeah, I'm giving it my all, Carey. Right. And that's the season. You think legacy. I'm 40. My question I ask myself every day, who's going to reach Lennox's grandkids? And what can I do now to set that person up for success?
It's a great question to ask at 39. Well done. Got a brand new book, Last Supper on the Moon. For those of you who are watching on YouTube, it is thick. This is not like, oh, here's a sermon series I converted into a book. You did a ton of research into this. And a lot of things I didn't know. For example, there really was a Last Supper on the moon. Do you want to talk about that for a moment?
Yeah, well, there was actually two. There was a Last Supper on the moon because Apollo 17, they literally ate dinner at the end of their 3-day-long mission, and they did eat their Last Supper. But the first supper on the moon was communion because Buzz Aldrin got permission to secretly bring bread and wine. And he, in July of 1969, read from Psalm 8 and John 15, and then had a communion service on the lunar surface. And that was the first, I can tell you, like, there's been nothing eaten on the moon ever that we know of until that was eaten. So in all of human history, bread and wine to honor Jesus was the inaugural eating that took place on the lunar surface. So that's just stupid how cool that is.
That is really cool. So you are a space nerd, self-confessed,
sure,
and a NASA nerd and all of that. You almost wrote like a history of the lunar landing. And tell me a little bit about your research process, your passion for this. This wasn't just, I'll do a bit of research for a book. This has been something that you've been passionate about for a while. I'd love to know about that.
Well, it's kind of interesting. That's a complicated answer, but the metaphor to me, I'm always looking for metaphor. Metaphor I crave, because simile and metaphor is all we have to take an unchanging gospel and bring it to a changing culture in a relevant way. That's why Jesus talked about sons that got lost from farms and birds and grapes and tares and wheat, because he was speaking to an agricultural society. So contextualization is key, right? You're trying to basically, it's kind of like the kingdom of heaven is like, the kingdom of heaven is like. So to me as a communicator, I preach like you do every Easter, and Jesus still gets out of the grave. Nothing changes. So really, you could preach the same sermon every Easter, but the only thing that's going to change is going to be metaphor and story and simile. And so how do you convey the power of the Holy Spirit? Jesus said it's like wind, it's like fire. And about 7 or 8 years ago, I began to realize that the words "a controlled burn" are a good metaphor for the Holy Spirit. Controlled burn. If it's not controlled, it's an explosion. If it's not a burn, then there's no power. So a bomb going off that's controlled is what? A rocket launch. So I began to communicate the Holy Spirit like a rocket, or like firefighting, where they do fires to prevent fires. And it's called a backburn. So that began for me a series of researching. I read Tom Wolfe's The Right Stuff, and I fell in love with the early days of NASA, the Mercury 7, and all of that. It's just insane. And I think the greatest thing mankind's ever done by a long shot is going to the moon. And that's saying a lot, considering the same year we went to the moon for the first time, 1968, was the same year that mankind did a heart transplant for the first time. But to go 250,000 miles away to another heavenly body and bring people there with 60s era technology, which was at a time when we didn't even have wheels on our suitcases yet, is astounding. And what a great metaphor for the greatest thing that's ever been done, which is not leaving this world, but Jesus coming to this world. So when I found out about the communion service, the fire was lit in me to utilize that 10-year saga, or 12-year-long saga, from Alan Shepard's first flight to the first moon landing as a metaphor to unpack the crucifixion, the ascension, the sending of the Spirit. And that's really what I was trying to accomplish in this book.
Wow. It's a fabulous work, and you weave through, seamlessly in Last Supper on the Moon. I'd love to know, you probably get emails from people who are conspiracy theorists and say, but Levi, the moon landing never happened.
Sure.
A question that you just roll your eyes at, or what do you say to folks like that?
Well,
and I ask it not because I'm curious as much about the moon. There's a ton of conspiracy theories, and they are having a heyday these days.
Sure. A lot of it is in no small way connected, no doubt, to the amount of recreational marijuana that is growing from coast to coast, I would assume. Yeah, it's interesting, Carey. I do get that a lot, and comments and very bizarre things about the flat earth and the moon's not real. And I addressed that in the book, and as a way to say, what do we do with the skepticism surrounding NASA, but also the skepticism surrounding Jesus? And I think that's an interesting parallel too, because there are plenty of people who would say, well, how do we know Jesus is who he says he is? And how do we know he rose? And so I try and really kind of give a case for both of those. You know, for one thing, the amount of work it would take to fake the moon landing, you know, considering that by the time we actually were launching Saturn V rockets, the most powerful rocket that man's ever built, that has been launched up until whenever the SLS launch takes place for the Falcon Heavy, which hasn't happened yet. It was an entire train car worth of paperwork every single time to fill an entire train boxcar with the amount of paperwork it took to launch one of those. So just the amount of work that would have gone into faking it would take more than to believe it actually happened. But a big part of it was the fact that they filmed simulations for the lunar landings on sound stages, so that if the TV interruption ever took place, which it did, Apollo 12, for example, one of the astronauts accidentally pointed the camera at the sun and it burnt out the optical component. So they had no way to show any video. So they were only playing audio on TV. So what they did was they showed a lot of the archival footage, which was astronauts with strings and all that. And that was the origin story of the conspiracy theories, that footage being out there. It's so funny to me. And I think if you've ever been up in an airplane, I mean, you could see it's not a flat earth, you know, and I think... you don't have to go very far to see that it's round. Yeah.
And I've been to Australia. I've been to New Zealand. There's a curvature of the earth there for sure.
I've got a friend who's been to space 3 times. You know, he lived on the space station for 6 months at a time. And Yeah, I love to ask him about it. It's very amusing.
That's a pretty elaborate lie, I guess, if he keeps doing that every few years, going up on the space station.
And we have lunar rocks. They brought back a lot of rocks from space. It's. I've seen Neil Armstrong's suit. And what does anybody stand to gain from having faked it is I guess the real question.
If you've been to the Smithsonian, the eagle, like the actual eagle that landed, is there, and it's so small.
Well, the eagle is still on the moon.
It is.
The legs of it. The actual descent vehicle that left from the moon crashed back into the moon because it wasn't strong enough to break free from the moon gravity. They returned home in Columbia, which is the command module, because it was 3 ships that turned into all came together as one: CM, SCS, the SM, and then the LM.
So, do you know what's at the Smithsonian then?
Yes, the Columbia, which is the part that splashed down in the ocean.
Yeah, that's right. Okay. My bad. But I remember seeing that with my boys when they were younger. And I'm like, boy, that thing's small.
Yeah. It's 12 feet in diameter by 11 feet height. And 3 people lived in it for 8 days.
I know. I'm like, you haven't got a lot of move. It's like a camping tent.
Now think about it. That's bowel movements. That's everything. And, they even have to figure out on the space station haircuts. Think about this. How do they do CPR on the space station? Because if someone needs CPR, you have to do chest compressions on a floating body while you're floating. So they would have to Velcro them down to a table, and you would leverage your feet against the ceiling. There's no up in space. The ceiling becomes the floor, right? So you have 4 floors. And then you have to leverage enough to get, the chest. It's just crazy to think about microgravity and what you have to factor in.
Levi, I wish we had more time today. You've been generous with it. I hope that gave people enough of a taste to want to dive in. But thank you for being so open, so vulnerable. I hardly got to any of my scripted questions. That's always the best interview.
Well, I do get into the panic attacks in here too. And I think Jesus was having a panic attack in the Garden of Gethsemane. So I think there's language and help for us who face these sorts of things in our lives.
Awesome. So people can find the book anywhere. It's doing really well. And where are you hanging
Hopefully
out?
Not at Goodwill yet.
What's that?
Hopefully not at Goodwill yet.
Not at Goodwill. And where are you hanging out online these days? You got podcasts.
Ooh. Well, not Wordle. Are you on that train?
You know what? I just did my first Wordle 3 months after the rest of the world. And I must say, I kind of get it now, but I'm only 3 in.
I'm so resistant to any trend like that. And I think that's some part of my nature.
My son and his girlfriend came and they're like, what? And I'm like, okay, I'll try it. And of course, I almost blew the first one, but I'm at 4 in the middle of March. Yeah. So what do I know?
I gotcha.
So Wordle, online, don't look for you there.
I turn on my screen restrictions. I stay off, but I'm on Instagram if I'm on anything, and then of course YouTube and all the things.
Okay.
So we have a Hey It's Lusko's podcast, which we do every week.
Levi, thank you so much. You're a gift to so many of us.
Carey. You're a legend.
Thank you for watching the Carey Nieuwhof Leadership Podcast on YouTube. I hope this episode has helped you thrive in life and leadership. And make sure you check out the Art of Leadership Academy. It's my brand new academy where I give you everything you need to lead, run, and grow a church. And now it's time for a generosity tip with Jim Shepard, principal at Generis, where they help you build a thriving culture of generosity.
Hey, church leaders. I want to talk today about pastoring and discipling people who have significant financial capacity in your church. Regardless of demographic, every church has them. Now, your financially capable people may look different than someone else's, but every church has them. A few people at the top who are just unusually capable with their financial capacity. I could actually make the case that they're the most overlooked people in the life of the church. But begin making sure that those people are vibrantly connected to something in your church that disciples them well. Maybe even consider putting a group together and you disciple them. They have special needs in terms of their ability. They have all the needs that everybody else in your church does. The only one that's different is they have a lot that they have to steward. And maybe it's good to have them in the room kind of, interacting with each other and growing together. Maybe that's a possibility. But the big idea here, begin to help those people understand how they can begin storing up treasures in heaven, not investment accounts here on earth.